They didn't just chain my wife's wheelchair, they tried to chain her future. But what they didn't know was this: the quiet woman they targeted wasn't just another disabled neighbor. She was the one person with the power to tear their entire system apart, law by law, brick by brick. We'd barely unpacked the silverware when the first knock came. 3 sharp raps, loud, clipped, and way too confident for a neighborly hello. It was our 4th day in Pinecrest Gardens, and I hadn't even finished labeling the moving boxes when I opened the door to a woman who radiated control. Perfectly curled blonde hair, red blazer pressed flat, smile painted on like lacquer. "James Taylor?" she asked, already extending a manicured hand. I nodded slowly. "Yes, we're still settling in." "Deborah Morgan, HOA president, just stopping by to get you signed up," she said, thrusting a thick folder at me like it was a subpoena. I took the folder but didn't open it. "Our realtor didn't mention an HOA. Newly voted in, mandatory now, just $350 a month." My jaw tightened. That was more than we budgeted for groceries. Before I could reply, the soft hum of wheels on hardwood echoed behind me. "James, who is it?" my wife Sarah asked, rolling into view. She looked tired but radiant, hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, a light blanket across her lap. Deborah's eyes dropped to the wheelchair and then flicked up, startled. "Sarah, this is Ms. Morgan. She's with the HOA." "Lovely to meet you," Sarah said, her voice as warm as a summer afternoon. Deborah barely blinked. Her eyes slid to the modest ramp we'd installed the night before, a small slope of aluminum over the single porch step. "That ramp," Deborah said slowly, "was that pre-approved?" "We built it yesterday so Sarah could safely get in and out," I said, voice tightening. "Well," Deborah replied, pulling a paper from her folder, "you'll need to submit a formal request. Architectural committee approval, of course." Her smile thinned. "Oh, and your mailbox and house numbers don't meet neighborhood standards. And I'm afraid we don't make exceptions." "We're on a fixed income," I replied calmly. "Medical expenses." "Then I suggest reviewing the fee schedule promptly. It's due next Friday." Sarah wheeled back into the house without a word. I held Deborah's icy gaze as she turned and walked to her SUV. As she left, she snapped a photo of our front yard like it was a crime scene. That night, as Sarah and I sat in the living room with a stack of forms between us, something shifted. Not just in our home, but in us. We came here hoping for peace. What we got was the first sign that Pinecrest Gardens didn't welcome everyone, especially not families like ours. But what Deborah Morgan couldn't know, not yet, was that Sarah had a past that reached far beyond this cul-de-sac. A past that would change everything. Deborah Morgan didn't wait a week. Just 3 days after our conversation, we found our first violation notice. Not in the mailbox, tucked under our windshield wiper like a parking ticket. "Improper vehicle placement," it read. We were parked in our own driveway. Sarah chuckled at first. "Is this some kind of joke?" But it wasn't a joke. 2 days later, another notice appeared, this time duct-taped to our front door in neon yellow. Unapproved exterior modification. Wheelchair ramp. $100 fine per day until removal. I felt heat rise to my face. I was angry, no, furious, but mostly confused. "We don't even belong to their HOA, I muttered, reading the paper again. "How can they fine us?" Sarah's smile had faded. She stared at the paper, then at the ramp. "They're trying to push us out." She was right. That afternoon, I called a property attorney. After I explained our situation, she paused. "Mr. Taylor, under state law, no HOA can retroactively impose membership on homeowners who purchased before it was legally formed. And harassing a resident over disability access, that's a serious ADA violation." Armed with her words, I wrote a formal cease and desist letter. I cited federal housing laws, disability protections, and sent it certified mail so Deborah couldn't claim she'd never seen it. The next morning, I woke to the sound of lawn equipment. I looked out the window and saw 2 men in landscaping uniforms tearing into our hedges. I ran out. "What are you doing?" One man barely glanced up. "HOA order, lawn height violation." "You're trespassing," I said, filming on my phone. "We're not in your HOA." The younger man looked uncomfortable. "Lady who hired us said you'd say that. Told us to cut anyway and bill you." And they packed up quickly when I mentioned police, but not before one muttered, "Good luck, buddy. No one wins against them." Later that day, while Sarah was working with Angela, her physical therapist, a police cruiser pulled up. The officer knocked. "We got a report," he said awkwardly, "about a business being run out of this address." "What?" I said. He gestured to Angela. "Multiple visitors weekly. Neighbors thought it was commercial activity." Angela calmly showed her license. "I'm a certified therapist. I help Mrs. Taylor manage her MS." The officer apologized and left, but we both knew the truth. This wasn't about a complaint. It was a warning. By the end of the week, our trash can was incorrectly placed, our blinds were not approved design, and Sarah's medical supplies were visible from the street. Another fine. It wasn't just enforcement, it was psychological warfare. And it worked. That night, as we lay in bed, the room quiet but heavy, Sarah whispered, "Maybe we should just join. Maybe it would stop." "No," I said gently, reaching for her hand. "They want us to break, and I won't let that happen." Just then, the power went out. At first, I thought it was a neighborhood outage, but as I looked out the window, I saw every other house lit up. Just ours, dark. I called the utility company. "There's no outage in your area," the representative said. "Someone must have manually switched it off." And just like that, our house went from a haven to a battlefield. I walked back to the bedroom, flashlight in hand, and sat beside Sarah's wheelchair. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Because deep down, we both knew this wasn't just about a ramp. It was about control. And they were about to find out they picked the wrong woman to chain down. I didn't think they'd go that far. But evil doesn't knock politely. It creeps in, quiet and deliberate, until it wraps itself around everything you love. It was just before sunrise. I was still half asleep, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee in the kitchen when I heard Sarah scream. "James!" Her voice cut through the morning air like glass. I dropped the mug and ran. There she was, on our front porch, tears running down her cheeks, chained to the railing like a prisoner. Her wheelchair had been shackled with a thick industrial chain, looped through the spokes and secured to the porch post with a padlock the size of my fist. Taped to her lap was an orange HOA violation sheet. "Ramp and porch modifications not approved. $500 fine per day until removal." She looked at me in horror. I came out to watch the sunrise. And then I couldn't move. I didn't hear anyone. My hands trembled as I tried to pull the chain free. It was too thick. I ran to the garage and grabbed bolt cutters. Our elderly neighbor, Frank, shuffled over in slippers and a robe. "What in God's name? Who would do this?" "The HOA," I growled, snapping the lock open with a loud crack. "And I've got the proof." Our doorbell camera had caught it all. At 5:43 a.m., Deborah Morgan herself, flanked by two other board members, Clee Henderson and Margaret Wu, snuck up our driveway, giggling like teenagers, and chained my wife's wheelchair while she slept inside. Deborah even posed for a selfie beside it. Frank's face turned crimson with rage. "You need to call the police, now." And we did. Officer Jenkins showed up 40 minutes later. I showed him the footage, expecting handcuffs and arrest, something. Instead, his face tightened. "Mr. Taylor, Deborah's husband, Tom Morgan, is close with the police chief. They golf, vacation together." "Are you saying you won't do anything?" I demanded. He raised his hands. "I didn't say that. I'll file a report, but these neighborhood disputes get messy." "Disputes?" Sarah wheeled up beside me, her voice calm but cold. "That wasn't a dispute. That was false imprisonment." He said nothing, just handed us a case number and left. That's when the neighbors started talking. Mrs. Patel from across the street whispered, They did the same thing to my sister. She had a hummingbird feeder they didn't like. They ripped it down. She fell, broke her hip. Sold her home to Deborah's brother a month later. The Garcia family? Their cultural ornaments smashed overnight. The Washingtons? Basketball hoop torn out while their kids cried, always after saying no to the HOA, always followed by harassment. And then came the blackouts. That evening, our power was cut again. When I called the electric company, they told me someone reported dangerous wiring and requested a shutdown. It would take 3 days to restore, unless we paid a $1,000 rush fee. In our fridge, Sarah's medication, temperature sensitive, vital. I sat in the dark, laptop plugged into the car battery, watching Sarah sleep in silence, our neighbor's extension cord running across the lawn to keep her medical devices alive. A violation notice was taped to his door the next morning. That was their message. If you help them, we'll come for you too. But Deborah made a mistake that day. She thought she was pushing a helpless couple to the brink. What she didn't realize was that my wife, she didn't just sit in a wheelchair. She once wrote the laws they were now breaking, and if they thought chains would stop her, they were about to learn what it's like when a woman with nothing left to lose and a law degree fights back. The house was dark, but my mind was wide awake. Sarah had finally drifted off to sleep, her hand curled gently around mine. But I sat there in the living room, staring at the soft blue glow of my laptop. I wasn't searching for comfort anymore. I was searching for the truth. Because something about all of this felt bigger than us. Bigger than one vindictive HOA. And I was about to uncover just how deep the rot ran. I started with public records, tax filings, property deeds, permits, anything with Deborah Morgan's name. At first, it was just odd patterns, landscaping contracts that cost 4 times the local average, security upgrades billed to the HOA that never appeared, and HOA board consulting salaries going directly to a company called Morgan Family Holdings. My pulse quickened. Digging deeper, I discovered that Morgan Family Holdings wasn't just some shell. It was a private business owned by Deborah's husband, and it had received over $750,000 in HOA payments over the last 3 years, for services that barely existed. I kept going. Using a public access portal, I pulled property transfer records for our neighborhood and cross-referenced every home sold in the past 5 years. Nearly every property had the same pattern. Original owner pushed out after HOA disputes. Home sold well below market value. Purchased by Morgan Development, a real estate company tied to Deborah's brother, renovated, then flip it for massive profit. They weren't just harassing homeowners, they were systematically targeting elderly, disabled, and low-income residents, forcing them out. They'd turned our neighborhood into a pipeline for profit, using harassment, fake violations, and legal gray areas to break people until they sold. And the worst part? None of it was legal. Their HOA had never been properly registered with the state. According to public filings, their original petition to form an HOA was rejected. They never had the 75% homeowner approval required. But they went forward anyway, pretending they had authority. And no one questioned it. Until now. By sunrise, I had hundreds of screenshots, documents, and maps saved to a flash drive. My hands were shaking. I walked into our bedroom and gently woke Sarah. "You need to see this." She wheeled beside me as I showed her the mountain of evidence I'd uncovered. Every time I flipped to a new file, her eyes grew wider. Finally, I opened a photo. A group picture from a housing law conference dated 2007. "Recognize anyone?" I asked. Sarah leaned in and let out a quiet gasp. There she was, younger, stronger, but unmistakably her. And beside her, smiling with her arm around Sarah's shoulder, Governor Elizabeth Reynolds. "She was your law school roommate, right?" I asked softly. Sarah nodded slowly. "We worked together on housing rights. She helped me pass legislation before I had to step away." I stared at her. "You think she'd remember you?" "I don't know," Sarah whispered, "but I'm going to try." And then, just as I was about to speak again, The front window shattered. A rock landed in our living room. Attached was a note, scrawled in thick black marker, "Leave now, or things get worse." Sarah stared at the note, then at the broken glass scattered across our rug. Her hands trembled on the wheels of her chair, but her voice didn't. "Call the governor," she said, "and tell her it's time to end this." I didn't even change out of my pajamas. I stood in the kitchen, barefoot, gripping my phone tighter than I'd ever held anything. Sarah sat next to me, poised, steady, even as her hands trembled ever so slightly against the armrests of her wheelchair. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but our living room was already bright with determination and quiet fury. I dialed the number Sarah hadn't called in over a decade, 3 rings. Then a woman's voice answered. Calm, commanding, familiar. "This is Governor Reynolds." Sarah swallowed. "Beth? It's Sarah Taylor." There was silence, then a small intake of breath. "Sarah?" the voice said, suddenly softer. "It's been years." Sarah exhaled, blinking away tears. "I wouldn't be calling unless it was serious. I need help." 10 minutes later, the governor had cleared her morning schedule. 2 hours later, her office confirmed a private meeting. And 24 hours later, she stood on our front porch. No camera crews, no motorcade, just a black SUV, 2 aides in discreet suits, and the same woman who once walked the law school halls with Sarah shoulder to shoulder, back when both of them believed they could change the world. When Sarah opened the door, the governor stepped forward and hugged her tightly. "You're still the strongest person I know." Sarah managed a small smile. "You might need to help me prove it." We sat in our living room while I pulled out the flash drive. The governor's face darkened as I scrolled through the violations, the videos, the contracts signed by Deborah Morgan's fake shell companies. She leaned back, stunned. "They've built a racket. Not just here," I said. "They've done this across 3 neighborhoods. We found at least 40 homes flipped under fraudulent pressure tactics. They target the vulnerable, the ones least likely to fight back." Sarah quietly added, "They chain my wheelchair to the porch, Beth. That's how far it's gone." The governor didn't respond right away. She simply reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. "Get me the state attorney general," she told someone on the other end. "Now." Within the hour, an unmarked state vehicle pulled up outside. 2 agents stepped into our home and quietly began reviewing our files. What followed was a whirlwind. They installed hidden surveillance around our porch, in our light fixtures, and a disguised body cam on Sarah's chair. "We need them to try again," one agent explained. "Catch them in the act." That afternoon, the governor made it official. She announced Sarah's reappointment to the state's Housing Rights Commission, a ceremonial position perhaps, but one that carried weight and headlines. Within hours, the HOA's group chat lit up. One of our neighbors tipped us off. Deborah Morgan was furious. Rumors flew that she was planning an emergency board meeting. Retaliation was almost guaranteed. We didn't have to wait long. At exactly 10:03 p.m., headlights lit up our driveway. I opened the blinds just a sliver, just enough to see Deborah Morgan, flanked by 3 board members, stepping onto our porch. They carried a folder and a pair of bolt cutters. Sarah gave me a nod. She pressed the panic button built into her wheelchair's armrest, and everything was in motion. We opened the door slowly. "Can I help you?" I asked, voice level, recorder running. "You can sign," Deborah said coldly. "This community doesn't need pity projects or press stunts. You resign from that commission, sell your house to the HOA at our offer, and we walk away. You don't? Well, things get worse." "I'll take my chances," Sarah said, staring her down. And Deborah smiled. That was when the sirens screamed through the night. 6 unmarked cars, 2 state cruisers, and a black SUV descended on our block. One of the agents stepped out, holding a warrant. "Deborah Morgan," he said firmly, "you're under investigation for racketeering, fraud, and civil rights violations." Deborah froze. Her face went pale. Tom Morgan tried to run. He didn't get far. Within minutes, all 4 HOA board members were cuffed and placed into state vehicles. One of the agents handed us a folder, a printed copy of their financial trail, now part of a broader state case. And just before Deborah was loaded into the SUV, she hissed, "You'll regret this." But Sarah just stared at her, calm and clear-eyed. "No," she said, "you will." As the SUVs pulled away, neighbors stepped out of their homes. One by one, they looked toward us. Some clapped, some cried, and one elderly man whispered, "Finally." We didn't sleep that night. But for the first time in weeks, it wasn't fear keeping us awake. It was hope. I've always heard that justice moves slowly, but sometimes when the right people are watching, it roars forward like a freight train. The morning after Deborah and her board were taken away, the neighborhood felt stunned. Mailboxes didn't open. Garage doors stayed shut. Even the birds seemed quieter, as if the entire street were holding its breath. Except our front yard. A steady stream of neighbors trickled by. Some brought casseroles, some brought tears, and some just offered quiet nods, acknowledgement that the spell had been broken. But Sarah? She was already at work. With the governor's backing and the agent's support, she began helping the State Housing Commission draft emergency legislation that would prevent any HOA in the state from operating without full homeowner consent, especially when it came to vulnerable residents like the elderly or disabled. And in the meantime, the trial date was set. Deborah Morgan, her husband Tom, and 3 board members were formally charged with conspiracy to defraud, illegal wire transfers, abuse of civil liberties, and most damning of all, federal ADA violations. The courtroom was packed for the first hearing. Sarah wore a navy blazer and her old law school glasses. She rolled into the courtroom like she belonged there, because she did. I sat behind her, hands clenched. I watched as Deborah entered, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. Her hair wasn't done, her makeup was smudged, and her smirk, the one we'd seen so many times, was gone. Our attorney rose and presented the evidence. The surveillance footage, the chain, the forged notices, the financial records linking HOA dues to personal luxury purchases. Then came the testimonies. Mrs. Patel, who had once been too afraid to speak, told the court how her mother fell and broke her hip after HOA goons destroyed her feeder. The Martinez family described how their daughter's walker was thrown in a trash bin by a board member cleaning up community clutter. And then it was Sarah's turn. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry, but she spoke in the clearest, most resolute tone I've ever heard. "They didn't just chain my wheelchair to a porch," she said. "They tried to chain my worth, my independence, my right to live freely in the country I served as a public servant. And they did it because they believed no one would fight back." She paused. They were wrong. Even the judge looked moved. When Deborah's attorney tried to argue that it was miscommunication or overzealous policy enforcement, the prosecutor played the audio clip where Deborah sneered, "Your little appointment won't save you." And just like that, the room shifted. By the end of the week, every member of the HOA board had taken a plea deal. But Deborah, she refused. She insisted on trial, and that decision, that arrogance, led to her downfall. Because during cross-examination, her lies unraveled one by one. Emails, texts, meeting minutes showing how the board targeted residents by medical status or age. The jury took less than 4 hours. Guilty. Deborah Morgan was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison without parole. Tom got 7. The other board members received between 3 and 6 years. But the sentence wasn't the most important part. It was what happened next. Governor Reynolds stood beside Sarah on the Capitol steps and signed the Homeowner Dignity and Protection Act, informally known as the Sarah Taylor Law. It was a sweeping reform. HOAs could no longer mandate membership retroactively. Any rule affecting disability access required state-level approval. And selective enforcement of HOA rules was now a civil rights violation, with criminal penalties. The crowd applauded. Some wept. Sarah looked out over the crowd and said, We didn't want a spotlight, we just wanted a safe home. But sometimes, when your peace is stolen, you stand, you fight, and you make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else again. I thought my heart would burst. Later that day, we returned home. Our house was still modest, still tucked under oaks, still with the ramp Deborah once called an eyesore. But now, it was a monument to persistence, to justice, to a woman who'd once feared she'd lost her voice, but found a way to use it louder than ever before. The strange thing about justice is that it doesn't immediately bring peace. After the cameras left, after the headlines faded, and after Deborah Morgan was locked behind bars, Pinecrest Gardens felt eerily quiet. The HOA signs came down one by one. The violation notices disappeared from mailboxes, but so did the neighbors who'd been too afraid to speak. Some moved away, still haunted. Others stayed behind, trying to understand how they'd allowed fear to shape the place they once called paradise. But for Sarah and me, the work was just beginning. The governor had asked Sarah to remain on the Housing Commission, and she agreed, on one condition. I want to rebuild what the HOAs broke, she told them, not just in law, but in spirit. And so, the restoration began. We started small. Frank, our elderly neighbor who had helped run a power cord when the HOA cut ours, became our community watch captain, not to spy on people, but to check in. He started weekly walks just to knock on doors and say, "You okay today?" The Patel family, whose mother had been targeted over a bird feeder, now led the neighborhood garden club. They replaced the rules about uniform lawn aesthetics with shared planter boxes, where herbs, tomatoes, and sunflowers grew side by side. And the Garcias, once fined for their cultural statues, were invited to lead a block party that celebrated everyone's heritage. Flags, food, and laughter filled the street where silence had once reigned. Even the children noticed. Gone were the whispered warnings about which yards they couldn't step into. Now chalk drawings colored the sidewalks again. Basketball hoops reappeared. Bicycles leaned on fences without fear of fines. As for us, Sarah and I, we opened our porch. Literally. We built a wide, sloped ramp that curved gracefully from the sidewalk to our door. A carpenter friend offered to help, and we installed a small bronze plaque that read, "Welcome, all abilities, all neighbors, no exceptions." Every Sunday we brewed 2 large pots of coffee and put out a few chairs. No invitations, no RSVPs, just a porch and a promise of listening. People came, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes for hours. We heard stories of silent struggles, of people who'd once feared speaking up and now finally felt seen. But the moment that broke me? It came on a warm Saturday morning. A moving truck pulled up across the street. A young mother stepped out, nervously guiding her daughter in a small wheelchair down the ramp. The girl, no older than 8, stared at our porch, wide-eyed. She saw Sarah sitting at the top of the ramp, smiling softly. "Mom," she whispered, tugging at her hand. "That lady's like me." Sarah wheeled down the ramp and waved. "Welcome," she said. "You're going to love it here." The girl smiled, big and fearless. That night, as we sat under the porch light, I turned to Sarah. "Do you ever think about the day they chained your chair to this railing?" She nodded slowly. "Every day." "And what do you feel now?" She looked out at the lit windows of our neighbors, the sound of distant laughter, and the gentle breeze rustling the sunflowers out front. "I feel free," she said, "not just because the chains are gone, but because the fear is too." She paused, then looked at me. "We didn't just save our home, James. We helped remind people what home actually means." It's strange, isn't it? How something as ugly as a padlocked wheelchair led to something as beautiful as this. A year had passed. Spring returned to Pinecrest Gardens, not just in the calendar, but in spirit. The lawns were still green, but now they looked a little wilder, a little freer. Wind chimes hung where warning signs used to. Laughter replaced suspicion. And as for us, we didn't just heal, we helped others do the same. Sarah's face had become familiar on State House floors and news broadcasts, not because she wanted recognition, but because her voice carried the weight of experience. She wasn't just an advocate for change. She was proof it was possible. The Sarah Taylor Act had passed with overwhelming support, setting a new standard for HOA accountability. It didn't just protect homeowners, it empowered them. Meanwhile, the community transformed. The new neighborhood board, elected fairly this time, was made up of veterans, retirees, teachers, and yes, even folks in wheelchairs. No red blazers or veiled threats, just people who believed that homes should feel like havens, not courtrooms. But not everything was easy. One afternoon, I spotted someone I didn't expect, Tom Morgan, former HOA enforcer and Deborah's husband, standing near the mailbox with a small box in his arms. He looked older, thinner, no longer arrogant, just tired. "I'm here to clear out the last of our things," he said, voice low. "Didn't expect to see you." I nodded. "You moving on?" He hesitated. "Yeah, honestly, it's for the best. I lost a lot, but maybe I deserved it." I looked at the box in his hands. A cracked picture frame poked out from the top. "Maybe," I replied, "but maybe next time you choose better." He nodded slowly, then walked away without another word. Forgiveness isn't always a grand gesture. Sometimes it's just choosing not to carry bitterness one day longer than necessary. That night, Sarah and I sat outside again. She'd just returned from another policy meeting in the Capitol, and she was tired, but peaceful. "I've been thinking," she said, eyes scanning the sky. "Maybe it's time we take a break. Travel, finally visit Yellowstone like we always talked about." I smiled. "You think the governor can spare her star advisor for a few days?" "She'll survive," Sarah grinned. A soft breeze rustled the wind chimes above us. The same one Sarah had picked out to replace the ugly security camera Deborah once installed. Down the street, children rode scooters. Someone was grilling. A dog barked. And for the first time in what felt like forever, nothing was out of place. Just life, as it should be. Before we turned in for the night, Sarah paused at the edge of our ramp, the very same one that once triggered a storm. It was now painted a soft blue, with flower pots lining the edges and a small bronze plaque at the base. "Freedom begins here." She rolled over it slowly, a quiet smile on her lips. "Think they'll remember?" I asked. She looked over her shoulder. "Maybe not the details, but they'll remember they were safe here, that's enough." And just like that, the story that started with chains ended with wings. Sometimes the greatest strength lies not in fighting fire with fire, but in standing your ground with truth, dignity, and unshakable love. Sarah's wheelchair was once chained in silence, but because she spoke up, others found their voices too. What began as cruel injustice became a catalyst for reform, proof that no matter your age, ability, or background, you have the right to live free from fear in your own home. This story reminds us, true community isn't built on control or conformity. It's built on compassion, respect, and the courage to protect one another, especially when it's hard. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to back down. Because the moment you do, you make room for others to rise with you.